Hello and welcome to the Living Lab lecture series. My name is Maja Schneider, and together with my colleague Anika Hannemann, we are going to talk about how we can preserve privacy in data processing. To motivate this topic, I want to give you an example. Let's consider some users, and these users are interacting with the world, for example, by using an app on their mobile phone. And by doing so, they are producing data. This data can now be used, for example, to train machine learning models, which are very useful to, for example, predict the behavior of other users that have not contributed to the data source. But this is also very useful for the users themselves because, for example, these apps that they were using can be improved through further personalization and give them a better user experience. But now it's possible that an adversary gains access to either the data source or to the machine learning model and can gain information about the users and their private data. We want to prevent this, and therefore we are going to present two different fields of privacy preservation. The first one is privacy preserving data publishing. This is used to protect the data source so that it can safely be published without revealing information about the users contained in the dataset. And the second is privacy preserving machine learning, which aims at protecting the machine learning models before they can be published or accessed by third parties. I'm going to start with the first topic, privacy preserving data publishing, and I'm going to present it on an example of mobility data. So mobility data is very valuable. It can give us interesting insights into mobility patterns, which can we use, for example, in urban city planning. We can find out with the help of such data where congestions are happening and where we need to build new roads in order to prevent them. In these two images here, you can see maps of the cities of Leipzig and Dresden in Germany, where bicycle data has been collected, and they show quite nicely which roads are the most frequented by bikes. And when we link such data to external data sources, such as accident statistics, we might find out where the most dangerous locations for a bike are in the city. Another application is taxi data. Here you can see taxi trips in the city of Porto in Portugal, and they are shown as origin-destination pairs, and the data is very useful for predicting where a taxi might be going and how long it will take until it arrives. And this is a very useful information if you want to schedule taxis in an optimal way. So if you get a new customer order, then you can schedule this customer to a taxi which might arrive in a destination close to where the new customer is supposed to be picked up. And with this, we can save driving time and also save the environment by reducing the amount of gas that is used. Also, we can use this data to get a better view of our world. Here in this example, you can see pollution data that has been collected in the city of Leipzig in Germany. And it's not complete, but you can see where spots are with high pollution. And this is a very interesting information if you want to prevent this. So we can link this data, for example, also with other data sources in order to create new models that better shape our understanding of the world. So mobility data is not only useful, it also has some privacy problems. When we look at this example here, we see a person walking with their smartphone around in the city, and by using an app which is tracking this person leaves traces of it behind, and these locations are shown here as red dots. And you can already see that there are some clusters forming, there are some agglomerations of points, and these are so-called points of interest because they hint towards something which is very private. You can see here that the person started at a home address, was then going to university, then going shopping, visiting a hospital, and then working out in a gym. And by analyzing these point clusters, we can infer all of those points for example, also by linking with external data. A real-world example you can see in the right image, which is showing Twitter data of the user, and you can very nicely infer where this user is posting the most of its comments and infer therewith the home address of this user. So by analyzing points of interest, we can find out a lot of private information about people. For example, their home and work address, or maybe also their educational level, their religion, their health status, their gender, their marital status, and a lot more. And of course, we want to prevent this. So before we can actually protect the data, we first need to find out how high is the privacy risk it involves. And this is an important step, because if we want to protect the data, we need to know to which extent, because we want to use the data after all, and by protecting the data, which means disturbing the data somehow, we also deteriorate its utility. But at the same time, we want to keep the privacy it contains. And therefore, we need to know how high the privacy risk actually is. And one way to do this, to measure the privacy risk, is to run attacks. And we can see here already an adversary who has gained access to the location trace of a person. And the first thing that an adversary might do is to infer where the actual points of interest are in the location trace. And in a second step, the adversary might try to find out what these points of interest mean, so to label them. But we could also connect the data and try to find out correlations in order to detect, for example, social relations between different users. So when we see that several users are going to the same university and then at the same time going to the same cafe, then maybe they are friends. Or if we see two persons that regularly visit the same building the whole day, then they might be work colleagues. We could also try to infer demographic information, which might reveal itself based on the pattern in the data. So for example, we could infer the age of a person by the way that they are moving. And lastly, we could also try to find out who actually produced this data, so to find out the identity of a person. And this is possible because human data is very unique, human mobility. A study has shown that already 4 points that are successively collected in a city are enough to reveal the identity of a person. And this is very critical. And it remains to be investigated if, for example, even less points of interest might be sufficient to infer the identity of a person. I want to give you an example of how to infer points of interest and to find out where they are actually located. And this is typically done with so-called stay point detection. And this approach actually uses the point clusters that you can see here in the images, and to use that they are spatially close and also temporally close in order to find out where the points of interest are located. We could also use other approaches that somehow look into what patterns are available in the data. For example, recurring behaviors, such as important places like a main station, might be easier to detect. On the other hand, we could also look into anomalies, because they reveal also information about points of interest, because they are deviating from the typical behavior, which can be detected, for example, by sparsity or by looking into detours from a typical road movement. To actually protect the data now, we are applying so-called location privacy preserving mechanisms. And these mechanisms are building on 2 basic concepts from the privacy preserving field. And the first is anonymization. In this example here, you see so-called k-anonymity. And this concept means that a user can hide in a crowd of k other users. And this can be achieved, for example, by generalization, like you can see in the image here. So 2 traces of 2 persons are somehow fused together into one. This, of course, adds some distortion to the data, but it also makes sure that these two traces are indistinguishable from each other. We could also achieve this, for example, by adding some dummy data. And the second approach is the so-called differential privacy. We also achieve this concept by adding noise, so by distorting the data. You can see in these examples here how this is done. In the first example, which is the lower image in the middle, the distortion is happening in the spatial domain, so each of the location points is somehow distributed in space. But we could also do this by adding noise to the temporal domain. And this you can see in the right image on the lower side. And you can see that successive location points are somehow smoothed so that they have the same temporal and spatial distance from each other. So to sum up, we have seen that mobility data is actually very useful. It can be used, for example, in the urban city planning context. But on the other side, it might also reveal a lot of private information about the persons who produce this data, such as their home or work address, their health, religion, and so on. We have seen that we can measure this privacy risk, for example, with the help of attacks that infer and label points of interest. And finally, we can protect this data by methods such as anonymization and differential privacy. And with this, I'm gonna give over to Anika, who's gonna present privacy-preserving machine learning.
Thank you very much, Maja, for the interesting introduction into privacy-preserving data publishing. Just like Maja already mentioned, I'm going to talk about privacy-preserving machine learning, short PPML. And for that, I brought you a use case of clinical data. So let's dive into it. So imagine this scenario that I tried to picture here on the slides. We've got a couple of hospitals that are collecting various kinds of data, medical records, EEG, or basically any other sensible data from its patients. And there is an incredible potential in all these data. With current state-of-the-art algorithms, diseases could be detected and treated at a very early stage, for example. But the data is private. Even with anonymization techniques, patients could be identified. And the consequence is usually that hospitals simply do not release their data for any kinds of data analysis. So at this point, we ask ourselves, what methods can be used to solve this dilemma? How can we perform private machine learning without, for example, storing the data in a centralized way? So as kind of an agenda, I've brought you 3 problems that we usually face when we do a PPML project. And especially the project that I'm currently working on is facing those topics. So first, we have to guarantee the data's privacy, of course. But what kind of privacy can we guarantee? How can we measure privacy, and how can we protect it? Secondly, we want the algorithm's utility to be as good as possible. And utility means, in this context, the functionality of the algorithm. And of course, we've got various institutions. You remember the hospitals, and they do not want to share their data. So we have to handle non-centralized data sets. How do we do that? So on my further slides, I want to briefly speak about all those 3 building blocks and talk about the solutions that I found for my current work, which is a multi-label classification of clinical data with PATI. So first, let's start with privacy. What do we mean by privacy, and how do we quantify it? How can we measure it? So there are 2 types of privacy. There is the individual privacy and there is group privacy. Individual privacy means that personal information about an individual has to be protected. So personal information about me and you. But with group privacy, Entire groups may experience restrictions on their privacy by having information about a subset of the group made public, which in turn can be used to draw conclusions about the rest of the group. Thus, if a model, for example, established a correlation between a phenotype and a genetic predisposition to a disease, like the example I brought here about black-haired people are more likely to get cancer, if a model established that correlation, inference can be made not only to the data within the training data group, but also to the entire group with that phenotype. And that is basically what happens when a model generalizes, which means it can recognize abstract structures within the training data set and then draw conclusions to other similar data. But this is what we use machine learning for. This is like the main goal of machine learning, to generalize and to find those structures, and therefore cannot be prevented by any external intervention. So group privacy or cross-population privacy cannot be protected within the scope of machine learning. But individual privacy can and has to be protected. For example, if an attacker finds out that an individual's data point is part of a certain data set or even identifies it, that's invading an individual's person's privacy. So if I come back to our hospital use case, if a data point of a patient gets exposed or identified in any way, this is something we want to prevent at any case. So after talking about the definition of privacy that we want to protect, we have to ask ourselves how to quantify it. Since we want to implement a privacy guarantee in our machine learning architecture, we need some kind of formalization. And there exists some kind of framework which is called differential privacy, which was proposed by Cynthia Dwerk. And it is a framework for evaluating the guarantees provided by any algorithm that was designed to protect privacy. So differential privacy is defined as following. If you have a look on the slide, we've got two neighboring data sets. There's the input data set and the input without access data. So that means they are neighboring data set. Two data sets, they only differ in one single data point. And we use the very same computation on those two data sets. So now if the difference of the output distribution is smaller than some epsilon, you can call the computation epsilon differentially private. So now if the epsilon is as small as possible, it means that the computation itself doesn't rely very much on that very single data point that is different in those two data sets. And that means every individual data point is protected as long as our epsilon, which can be seen as our privacy budget, is not exceeded. So if we implement differential privacy with a small epsilon, we protect the algorithm from any kind of attack on the individual training data points. But how can we achieve differential privacy? So the basic idea is to randomize part of the algorithm's behavior to provide privacy. And in simplified terms, we can achieve differential privacy by carefully adding noise to the data or to some step within the training process. And intuitively, that makes sense because we limit the information content of the individual data points. Of course, we do not simply blur the training data as it's shown very simplified here in this picture. And we actually rarely add noise directly to the data itself. But the trade-off between privacy and utility can be seen here. And this is something that we usually face. So basically, we've got a Pareto optimization. We want to have the highest privacy, so the smallest epsilon possible, while maintaining the highest utility, which is in this context, the highest functionality of the algorithm. So we have talked about the first two problems of our hospital use case, how to define and to guarantee privacy, and we've talked about the privacy utility trade-off. So let's now have a look at the method that we use to tackle the third problem, which is data that is not stored centrally, but at various hospitals who do not want to share their data. So let me introduce you to the PATE framework, which means privacy aggregation of teacher ensembles, which was proposed by Nicholas Papernut et al. So on the very left side on the slide, you can see our hospitals storing privacy-sensitive data. So what we do now is we train independently on every hospital node a machine learning model, depending, of course, on the problem that we want to solve. For example, if our patient's data consists of X-ray pictures and we aim to predict some disease, we train independently on every node a CNN. So now if we want to inference the models on this disease we've trained the models on, every hospital makes a prediction on the input X-ray we want to predict, and then we forward the output vector, so the output prediction to a common node, to a trusted node. And then for a multi-class problem, such as disease A, B, or C, we count the votes for each class. And then we perturb that node by adding random noise sampled from Laplace or Gaussian distributions. So this is called a noisy aggregation mechanism. And this noisy aggregation mechanism provides privacy to the data while still maintaining the functionality of the algorithm of the CNNs, as long as the consensus among the individual classifiers are high. So if you recap my introduction into differential privacy, you might remember that privacy budget epsilon we want to stay in. So the problem now for this architecture is for every prediction we make, we have to compute the privacy budget and accumulate it. So eventually our privacy budget exceeds when we do a lot of inference. And also the model itself cannot be published. Otherwise, an adversary could inspect the internal parameters of the published model to learn things about the private data they are trained on. That's why a secondary step in PATE is needed to transfer the knowledge of the models trained at the hospitals, we call them teacher, to another model, which we call student. And for that, we either create data synthetically or we use public data to label them by our teacher models. And then the labeled data is used to train a student, which now can be safely used for inference. So the private data and the private models can now be discarded, and our privacy budget is a fixed value that was used to train the student. Yeah, and this is how we perform machine learning on decentralized data sets in a privacy-preserving way. So to sum it up, we have talked about privacy, how we define privacy and how we can protect it. We have talked about the trade-off between privacy and utility in PPML, and that we can usually work with that. And I introduced you to an architecture which makes privacy-preserving modeling on decentralized data sets possible. It is called PATE. And so I hope you could get some insight about on my current work, which is noisy aggregation methods for multi-label PATE classification. And I hope you guys enjoyed a little introduction to privacy-preserving data publishing and privacy-preserving machine learning. And I hope to see you soon in Leipzig at ScaDS.AI. Bye.